earning over $1 million, playing 100, 200, and buying in for 50K, making over 6 figures in just a month. Most people hear those moments and think, oh, that's probably when he felt like he made it in poker. But that's actually not true. The moment I felt the proudest and the richest was crossing $100,000 earned in my very first year playing full time. And the reason for that is because prior to poker, I was paying the bills with a $15 an hour job, passing out energy drinks out of the back of a pickup truck. After earning my first 100K, I finally felt like I could breathe and I didn't have to worry about paying for groceries or the rent or car insurance. As far as I was concerned, I was rich as hell. And so in this video, I'm going to show you literally the only 2 things I would work on if I was back trying to earn my first $100,000 playing poker. And neither of these 2 things are what I see the majority of poker players focusing on. To be clear, is watching this video alone going to make you 6 figures? Absolutely not. But if I was starting over today, broke, back passing out energy drinks out of a lifted F250, these are the 2 things I would focus on to make my first 100K. Let's jump in. All right, guys, so this is it. As clear as humanly possible, the 2 things. Number 1, what is my opponent's range? And number 2, what happens if? So I'm going to walk you through exactly how to do this, and more importantly, how you can build this skill on your own and get better for it with a plethora of examples. And quick disclaimer for YouTube, all of these examples which we're about to walk through, these are for educational purposes only. All of these are fictitious, made up hands. I made them up while I was parasailing in a hot air balloon with Oprah Winfrey while summering in Yugoslavia. All right, so we're going to start off with wide configurations. For example, our opponent opens on the button and we defend in the big blind. This may be the widest configuration. What do I mean by a wide configuration? This just means when we have a bunch of hands in our range, our opponent's opening a shit ton of hands on the button, we're defending with a shit ton of hands in the big blind. So we're going to work our way from very wide configurations like this, button versus big blind single raise pot. We each have a lot of hands that we're playing from these positions. And as we go through the video, we're going to work our way to very tight configurations, which may be a 4-bet pot, right? Because in a 4-bet pot, we don't have very many hands. It's a very tight or narrow configuration. All right, so we defend in the big blind. We see a flop. We flop middle pair here. We check it over to our opponent, the pre-flop raiser, and they c-bet $25 here. Now, we have all the categories here. Can play for stacks, thick value, thin value, draws, and air. All right, guys, so the first thing I want to touch on when ranging, I want to put our opponent's hands into buckets. Instead of saying,
oh, I think he has ace-7 offsuit with the 7 of clubs.
No, we're going to start off very wide, and then we're going to get more granular as the hand goes on. So number 1, CPFS. And this is something, again, that I just made up in my head in the shower. I have a lot of good ideas in the shower. This just means can play for stacks. This just means we're fist pump getting in the money with this hand. And this is all context dependent, right? Maybe top pair, no kicker as it can play for stacks hand 80 big blinds deep against a whale who's been drinking. But maybe bottom set is not a can play for stacks hand against an old man coffee when we're 400 big blinds deep, right? So context matters. This is more of a feel thing. This just means if all the money goes in right here, right now, does this hand fist pump get it in all of the time? That's it. So can play for stacks. An example, 200 big blinds against an unknown player. Maybe we'll use our Jack 9 deuce. Look at that sweet baby there. Can play for stacks hand, maybe pocket 9s, pocket deuces, right? Thick value, just 1 step down. This is just if we go bet, 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 and our opponent goes call, 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 we are very, very happy. But if our opponent starts check raising at any point, particularly on the turn or the river, we start feeling a little bit squeamish. So same type of board, thick value, maybe ace jack or pocket kings or something like that. Thin value, 1 step below that. If we go bet, bet for 2 streets and our opponent calls, we feel great, but probably not a 3 street hand. So maybe pocket 10s on Jack 9 deuce, or maybe even Jack 8 suited or ace 9 suited, right? Definitely not thick value, but still better than showdown value. Next category would be showdown value, and this is just if the hand checks all the way to the river right now, do we just win the pot a reasonable percentage of the time? An example maybe like ace king high on Jack 9 deuce, or maybe pocket 4s on Jack 9 deuce, right? One category below that, we're gonna lump all of our draws together. Sometimes I separate these out, but for the sake of this video, we're just gonna try to keep it simple. Just basically a hand that has some equity to make a better hand, a straight draw, a flush draw, whether it's a gut shot or an open-end combo draw, right? We're just kind of lumping all of our draws together for now for the sake of ranging. And finally, air just means no draw, no showdown value. And the way I like to look at this is what can we eliminate? Well, a lot of players, yours truly included, are just c-betting all of their hands as the pre-flop raiser. So at this point, I would say we probably can't conclude a whole hell of a lot. Maybe if we're against a more trappy player like Helmuth who likes to check back when he flops a set or something like that, we can eliminate some of their can play for stacks, but we don't know this player. Or maybe we're against a more passive player who just doesn't barrel when they flop air or low equity draws. We can eliminate some of those. goes, but let's just say we're against an unknown so we can eliminate absolutely nothing. Now, we face a double barrel for a reasonable size here on the turn. At this point, can we eliminate anything? Well, let's look at can play for stacks. So a lot of players here, if they have like pocket nines, pocket threes, queen nine, something like that, they would keep betting. So can play for stacks is still in there. Thick value, maybe a hand like ace queen. This hand would probably keep betting. Thin value, maybe a hand like 9x or pocket tens. Would this hand keep betting? Well, the board is relatively wet and dynamic. Some of these hands may start checking back, but I'd imagine a lot of live low stakes opponents would keep barreling these hands because they kind of let fear guide their decisions. So they may have some thin value. What about showdown value? Well, I think this is the one we can start to eliminate. If our opponent has a hand like pocket sevens or pocket fives or ace three of hearts or something like that, I'd imagine a lot of those hands start to check back. So we can start to eliminate showdown value. What about draws? Well, this board is super draw heavy. We've shown zero aggression here, and so I imagine our opponent would still barrel draws. And what about air? Now, this is opponent dependent, it's context dependent, but I imagine a lot of opponents here, even the ones that just c-bet a lot on the flop, aren't going to keep barreling with pure air here. Now, they may barrel with a bunch of draws, but pure air here, man, it's hard to find. Maybe a hand like king four of spades or something like that. A lot of opponents are just going to start checking back the pure air. So we can eliminate some of the air, we can eliminate some of the showdown value. So we're going to call one more time. We go to a river, which is a queen, pairing the board. We check it over, and now our opponent triple barrels here on this river. Can play for stacks. Are they still betting can play for stacks? Well, sure. If they have a full house, they are still betting at this juncture. Thick value. Well, this one's tricky because some of their thick value hands like kings or aces or something like that have now been downgraded to maybe a thin value hand. So sure, the thick value hands now have been narrowed, I would say. The thick value hands are now like king queen and queen jack and queen 10. So yes, I think they're still betting thick value, but the amount of thick value hands they have has now shrunk. Thin value. Are they betting hands like kings or aces or tens or something like that on this river? And I would say no, most likely not. So we can eliminate thin value. We had already eliminated showdown value. They probably don't have showdown value here. Let's look at draws. Well, there's no draws because we're now on the river, so we can eliminate that. Now let's look at air. How much air do they have getting to this river? Well, busted diamond draws, busted straight draws like jack 10 or king 10 or king jack, busted club draws, busted backdoor straight draws, hands like 7-8 or 4-5 or 7-5, stuff like that. So they have quite a bit of air here. So looking at their range on this river, their range is going to be some can play for stacks, some thick value, and quite a lot of air. So now that we've got their range, we've done step one. Step two is now simply ask what happens if? What happens if we fold here? Well, we put $0 more into the pot, but the question is asking, is calling or raising? Could either of these options be more positive EV than a $0 decision here, which folding would be? So what happens if we call? Well, we beat all of their air and we lose to the thick value and air can play for stacks. And now what happens if we raise? Well, the air folds, which we already beat, and the thick value and it can play for stacks probably just snap us off. So raising doesn't seem like a good option. And to me, when walking through those three options here, because they do have a bunch of air in their range, and they're probably not going thin on this river, and only betting can play for stacks and thick value, which means they don't have a whole lot of value combos getting to this river. So my decision after walking through their range, after walking through what happens if, I would put in the call on this river. And maybe asking,
well, Mark, what happens if this player is passive?
Okay, let's walk through that. Let's say we're playing against passive plop here, and say this player is not going to c-bet when they have air or when they have showdown value. They're just only going to c-bet their value hands and their big draws. Okay. Well, so when this player c-bets on the flop here, we can play for stacks, we have thick value, we maybe have thin value, and we have some draws. We can eliminate showdown value and air right away. And now we get a turn barrel from this passive player. We can probably eliminate thin value. We can eliminate some more of the draws. And so now at this point, they have maybe a few draws left, but their range is primarily can play for stacks and thick value. Now we get to this river and facing a triple from a passive player. We just know this guy's going to under triple barrel his draws. So getting to this river, he has very little air because some of his draws he checks back on the flop, some of his draws he checks back on the turn, and some of his draws he gives up and checks back on the river. So he just doesn't have much air here. And so his range on this river is primarily going to be can play for stacks and thick value. And so at this point, again, I'll be going through what happens if. Obviously, we don't want to raise into a range that contains those types of hands. Calling doesn't seem great because this guy doesn't have nearly as many busted draws for air. And so folding here seems like the best option against a more passive player. Obviously, very elementary, very, very simple, but I want to start off simple and we can ramp up the complexity as we go. So let's do that right now. All right, again, we are going to be in the big blind defending, and on this flop, our opponent actually checks it back. So what can we eliminate from our opponent's range here? I would say against most players, we can eliminate a lot of that can play for stacks, and we can eliminate a lot of the thick value. So the range is probably mostly going to be after they check back on a wet dynamic board. It's going to be thin value, showdown value, draws, and air. That's pretty much going to be their range. We get to the turn, and we turn an open-ended straight flush draw. We already know our opponent's range, so now the question I would be asking is, what happens if? All right, let's say we come out and bet here. How is each part of our opponent's range going to respond? Well, thin value is probably going to call, even if we choose a big size. Showdown value will probably call up to a small to medium size. Draws will probably call up to a big size here, and air is just going to fold no matter what. Now, what happens if we check? Well, if we check, I would imagine that thin value is probably going to start betting right now. A lot of their draws after we check twice is probably going to start betting right now. Showdown value could go either way. A lot of guys will just check back here with showdown value, but some guys will take a hand like ace 3 or pocket 4s or something like that, and they'll just start betting here because they don't want to give us an overcard if we have like ace jack or something like that, and they don't want to see a bad river card roll off. And then with air, once we check twice, unless you're the most passive player in the world, a lot of players will start taking a stab with air right here, right now, just trying to fold us off a hand like ace high. So if we check, quite a lot of our opponent's range is just going to put in more money for us. Air may just bet. Draws, thin value, showdown value may just bet if we check, whereas if we just come out and bet, he's going to be calling with a lot of his range and then folding air, maybe folding showdown value. But if we check, maybe 70, 80, 90% of his range, as you can see here, is just going to bet itself. So what would we like to do here? Well, when we walk through what happens if, when we consider our opponent's range, I would like to check here to get our opponent to put in more money for us with some portions of their range that would just fold if we came out and bet ourselves. Now we can go for the big boy check raise, and the reason why we can go for the big boy check raise, we've already determined our opponent can play for stacks and thick value here. So let's just go for the biggest size that our opponent may call with some of his draws, may call with some of his thin value. Look, we already got our 30 bucks from his air. We already got our 30 bucks from his showdown value. We're not going to get any more money from those hands. Let's just maximize now against the thin value and the draw portion of his range. So we go big, our opponent calls, and now getting to this river, what is our opponent's range? Well, we can eliminate air. We can eliminate showdown value because our opponent called the check raise on the turn. So getting to this river, our opponent's going to have busted draws, which are now air, and our opponent's going to have some thin value. Maybe some 9x, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, something like that. And sure, occasionally, they could have a weak queen here that upgraded to thick value on this river. Occasionally, could be true. So what happens if on this river when considering our opponent's range? We have a couple options here. We can check, we can go small, we can go large. What happens if we check? Well, if we check here, our opponent's going to check back with all of their thin value, and we're going to lose. Our opponent may bet if they back into a weak queen here occasionally, so maybe they would bet sometimes with their trips, but I don't know. I see players here just sometimes check back if they have a hand like queen 8 suited or something like that after we check raise the turn. So I'd imagine they're going to check back with their thin value and even their thick value at a reasonable frequency here. And then what are they going to do with their air? Well, their air may stab occasionally, but most live low stakes players lean more on the passive side than the aggressive side, especially when we take in a turn check raise line. So I'd imagine they're just going to check back here at a high frequency with their entire range we've assigned them, which means if this goes check check, well, we are never winning this pot with 5 high. So what happens if we bet small? Betting small here is a reasonable option. If we bet small, we just fold out all of our opponent's air. We lose the minimum when our opponent has a queen because they're never folding a queen, right? They snap us off with queen X. And they probably call here when we have like 10s or jacks or something like that. So this seems reasonable. We could fold our opponent's air and get a very cheap price on our bluff. Other option here on this river may just be shoving in all of the money and just trying to get them to fold jacks, 10s, 9x at a very high frequency, right? If we get them to fold this stuff at 80 to 90%, and we get snapped off by trip queens 10, 5% of the time, whatever, still going to have a very profitable play here. So those are the two options I kind of like on this river, either going very small, trying to fold out the air, or going very, very large and trying to fold anything but a queen. And remember, when they check back the flop, they just don't have a whole hell of a lot of queen X in the range, particularly when a queen pairs on the river. They're just not going to have many trips here. So again, this is how I like to walk through it, winnowing down their range throughout the hand, and then just simply asking what happens if. All right, well, what if we played this same spot, but we had a value hand instead of a bluff? Well, same thought process here on the turn. Their range primarily going to be thin value, draws, and air. So I would want to check again here with a value hand for the same reasons why we would want to check when we have a bluff, because that's the best way to get our opponent to start putting in more money with the majority of their range. We still want to go for the same check raise size, right? Because our bluffs and our value have the same size on this turn, which is get our opponent to put in the most amount of money possible right here, right now. Now on the river, this is where our goals diverge. So again, what happens if on this river we just walk through it with a bluff? Same thing with value. If we check, our opponent's going to check back at a pretty high frequency here, most likely. We come out and bet small. We get snapped off by the trip queens and the 9x and pocket 10s in the air folds. If we come out and bet very large, maybe we get everything to fold except the rare trip queens they have. So maybe here our goal is to make sure that we get the maximum from hands like ace 9, king 9, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, all of that type of stuff. And so maybe here the best size we could do that, maybe 400, 450, maybe even 500, pushing the edge, something like that, trying to get value against the thin value portion of our opponent's range, which thin value and air are going to be the majority of the range getting to this river. If you put these 2 steps into practice right now, can I promise you're going to make 100 grand over the next year, or bump your win rate to $75 or $100 or $150 an hour? Absolutely not. But if this stuff is starting to click for you and you want myself, Gethin, our team of coaches who have earned multiple millions of dollars playing live, to take a look at your game and give you personal feedback, right? If you want to be put on the spot like this, where we walk you through a hand and you range the opponent and we walk through this thought process and help you build the thought process that I am demonstrating right here, if you want our help to build this, that's what we built our 5-day small group coaching program for. It's called Basecamp. It's highly interactive. It's super tactical. We're not going to focus on a bunch of rah-rah mindset, woo-woo BS. Nothing wrong with that. That's just not what we focus on. We focus on building your actual thought process at the table. So the next time you're playing a big pot and you're in the heat of the moment, you have something to fall back on. You can actually range your opponent and ask what happens if in 15, 30, 40 seconds. So you're not the guy sitting there tanking, panicking, wondering what to do while everybody at the table is checking their watch and debating, calling clock on the guy for taking so long. No, that's not you. Instead, you're cool, calm, collected. You have a repeatable thought process just like I'm showing you in this video that you can rely on in the moment. And our team of coaches, these are all crushers. Just for context, guys, I'm paying our team of coaches about 1.2 million this year. You may be like, wow, that's a lot of money. And yes, I agree, it is, but it takes real money to get guys who are actually crushing in live games to stop crushing in live games and to come coach with our team. These are real vetted crushers. Our co-founder, my friend Gethin, was my own personal coach, the only poker coach I've ever had. So anyway, it's interactive, it's highly tactical, but it's all virtual, so you can show up in your underwear if you want. Just don't tell us you're in your underwear, right? Keep the camera above your, I may be in my underwear right now. I'm not telling anybody. It's 5 days, 2 to 3 hours a day. You get our feedback in real time, and we help you put all of this into practice. If that at all sounds interesting, check out our 5-day Basecamp. All right, next one, button's gonna open. We defend in the big blind with king, queen this time, flop middle pair. We're gonna defend to a c-bet. Again, can't really eliminate much of our opponent's range when they just c-bet on this board, but once they double barrel here, when the flush comes in, at this point, we can probably start eliminating all types of stuff. They still can play for stacks like flushes here. They may still have thick value like sets and 2 pair. Thin value, probably start to eliminate the thin value, right? If they have like a weak ace here, they're probably not still betting when the Broadway straight and the flush comes in. Draws, well, not a whole lot of draws here, right? The flush draw just got there. All of their straight draws that had a 10 in it just made a pair. We can probably start to cross off quite a few of the draws here. We can probably start to cross off the thin value. We can probably start to cross off the air. So what is their range here? It's probably mostly going to be thick value and can play for stacks. Well, we have the king of spades in our hand. We're getting a decent price. We got a lot of money behind, so we're going to call. We see a river, and now our opponent triple barrels. Again, what is their range here on this river? Probably just primarily going to be can play for stacks and thick value, right? They have a ton of can play for stacks hands, a ton of flushes that may just open on the button. Maybe hands like jack 8 of spades. Maybe hands like 5, 6 of spades, right? They got a ton of flushes here, and then they have sets as well, right? Pocket queens, pocket aces, pocket 7s, ace queen, ace 10, queen 10, right? They just have a ton of can play for stacks and thick value here. No draws because we're on the river. Not really much air because what air is still double barreling the turn here? Not a whole lot of air that's easy to assign in their range. Probably not really any thin value or showdown value. So their range here, thick value and can play for stacks. So what do? We want to fold. Okay, we've been playing these wide range spots. Let's make it a little bit narrower here. Now we're going to face an open from under the gun. So I'm going to show you why this matters, right? Why does it matter if they open from early position versus on the button? So same type of situation here. Now our opponent c-bets. Can't really eliminate a whole lot from his range yet, but now he double barrels on the turn. And on this turn, let's think about what we can eliminate. Well, we can eliminate a lot of the air, and we can eliminate a lot of the draws, and we can eliminate a lot of the thin value, just like we talked about in the previous example, right? Not a lot of draws because the flush has gotten there. The Broadway straight has come in. in. So if they did have a hand like Jack 10, they've now made a pair. A lot of players may just check back because now that's showdown value. So not a lot of draws, not a lot of air, not a lot of showdown value, not a lot of thin value. Their ace X hands may just check back here. They do still have thick value, right? We've got a bunch of thick value hands like pocket queens, ace queen, ace 10, maybe even pocket 10s that range bet on the flop, right? They still have a lot of thick value here. But do they can play for stacks? Do they have flushes? Well, yeah, of course they have flushes, right? Let's think about this. They open from the low jack, and if we're playing against a reasonable player, what does their open range look like from the low jack? Well, it's going to be a whole hell of a lot tighter than the button. And so let's think about what reasonable flushes they could have here. Now, if they're a loose, kind of splashy player, might they have flushes? Sure. But against a typical 2-5 player, let's walk through what flushes they have. Is a player from the low jack opening a hand like 5-6 of spades or 4-5 of spades? Probably not. Right? Might they open 9-8 of spades sometimes? Sure, okay, occasionally, but besides maybe 8-9 of spades and specifically queen jack of spades, what flushes do they have here? Are they really gonna open jack 9 of spades from the low jack? Okay. Maybe. Okay, they just don't have a whole lot of flushes here, whereas opposed to when they open on the button, they have a whole plethora of flushes. So my point here is, can play for stacks, are there still a few partial traces of combos we can run into? Sure. But when we have the king of spades in our hand, blockers, they just don't really have many combos of flushes opening from the low jack here. So their range primarily just going to be thick value here. So we talk about what happens if, well, probably don't want to fold with the king of spades in our hand. What happens if we call? Well, we can realize and try to see a river against the thick value portion of our range. If we do get a spade, are we going to get paid even by a hand like pocket queens or ace queen or something like that? If we hit, probably not, unless they specifically have ace queen with the queen of spades. Okay, that's one hand that can pay us on the river. But if we call, we're probably not going to win a bunch of money on the river. What happens if we check raise here? Well, we're not running into a whole lot of brick walls. Really, the only brick walls we can run into at a reasonable frequency are queen jack of spades and maybe 8-9 of spades, and maybe if they got a wild hair up their ass, jack 9 of spades, something like that, right? That's pretty much it. So on this turn, maybe a reasonable spot to go for the check raise here and start trying to push that fold equity. You want to choose the biggest size here on the turn, where we're still going to have that big boy overbet behind on the river. And now on this river, again, what is our opponent's range? Well, nothing has changed on this river. Probably not going to be much can play for stacks. Probably mostly going to be thick value. So on this river, if I think our opponent's capable of folding a 2-pair hand like ace queen or queen 10 or something like that, I may go for the jam on this river. And now, if you're against an opponent who's never folding a set or 2-pair in a million years, this check raise on the turn is a punt. And what we should be doing every time we have a flush here, or every time we have a hand here that beats 2-pair, well, we just pile in all the money. Easy game. But against a typical 2-5 player, I may push back and say a lot of players here, when the flush comes in, when we take this super aggressive line, check call flop, check raise turn, overbet jam river, I'd expect a lot of players here to fold 2-pair in even sets. Now, if that's not applicable to the game you're playing, you know exactly what to do. But if it is, you also know exactly what to do. So again, it's not about the calibration here of,
Mark, players in my games will just do.
I don't give a shit. What matters is that we can properly range and properly ask what happens if. Because if the players are doing X, then we do Y, and if the players are doing Y, then we just do X. Easy game. All right, let's throw a little loop in this. Let's say our opponent c-bets on the flop, and now they check back on the turn. Now it is our opponent's range. So now at this point, I would say we can eliminate the can play for stacks for sure, right? Not gonna have queen jack of spades or 8-9 of spades. Like we can just already just trace partials of that. And the thickest of value here, maybe pocket queens, pocket 10s, ace queen with the queen of spades, that type of stuff, would probably keep betting at some frequency here. So what is most of our opponent's range going to be when they check back on this turn? Probably going to be quite a lot of thin value and showdown value. Maybe a little bit of thick value, but mostly thin value and showdown value. So we go to the river, and again, our opponent's range here, some thick, a lot of thin, and a lot of showdown value. So what happens here if we bet? Where we get snapped off by the thick, and the thin value probably folds, showdown value probably folds. What happens if we check? Well, maybe the thick value goes for a bet here on this river. If they have queen 10 or ace queen to check back the turn, they probably go for some value here if we check. And if they do have thin value or showdown value that we beat, well, they probably check back, and if it goes check, we just win at a very high clip. And sure, sometimes we lose to weak ace X or whatever, but that's okay. Most of the time, if this goes check, we're gonna win at a reasonable enough frequency. So after considering what happens if and considering our opponent's range, I would go for a check here. Now our opponent comes out and bets 60. So what is our opponent's range? Well, thin value and showdown value, probably going to check back. They don't have can play for stacks because those hands would just bet the turn and they don't have many flushes in the first place. So what is the range? It's just going to be thick value, right? Just going to be thick value. And again, what happens if we call, we lose. If we fold, we lose $0 more. But what happens if we raise? Do we think we can ever get our opponent to fold a hand like ace queen or pocket sevens here? And if the answer is yes, well, pile in a shit ton of money then and get those hands to fold. And if the answer is no, then just check fold. See, it's not really about the answer, it's about going through the process of what is our opponent's range and what happens if. All right, let's play one as the pre-flop aggressor, and we're gonna open here, our opponent defends. Look at that sweet baby there. We see bet and our opponent raises, and we actually start this hand 300 big blinds effective. So what is our opponent's range when they check raise on this flop? Well, gonna be can play for stacks. Could be some thick value, maybe a hand like ace jack or something like that, and maybe some draws as well. Not gonna be thin value, not gonna be showdown value, not gonna be air. So we can eliminate those. Now we go to the turn and a flush comes in, and now our opponent checks. So what is our opponent's range when they check here now on the turn? And I would say at this point, our opponent's range is squarely going to be thick value and thin value, and we can eliminate can play for stacks. So why can we eliminate almost all of the flushes here? Well, number one, how often does the pool check raise naked flush draws on the flop? I would say not that often, maybe 8%, 10%, 15% of the time, right? And if they're super aggressive, maybe 20 to 25%. And if they're super aggressive, if they're going to check raise their flush draws on the flop, if they're a very aggressive player, what is an aggressive player going to do on the turn when they get there? They're going to keep betting. And if they're a more passive player, are they going to check raise their flush draws on the flop? Probably not. So more aggressive players aren't going to check here with their flushes, and more passive players don't even have flushes here. So overall, they just don't really have can play for stacks. So what is their range? It's going to be a whole shit ton of thick value. And what hands got downgraded to thick value on this turn? Hands like pocket nines, jack nine, pocket deuces, all of these hands. So what are we going to do here on this turn now that we've determined our opponent's range is almost primarily going to be thick value, maybe a smidge of thin value like ace jack? What are we going to do here now that we've determined our opponent's range? Well, what happens if we check back? Well, we just get to realize for free, which is okay. What happens if we bet though? Well, if we bet all of the thick value calls, look how deep we are. And then if the board doesn't pair on the river, we're going to have quite a few opportunities here, particularly when we start this hand 300 big blinds deep. I may want to choose the biggest size here on this turn that a hand like jack nine is going to call. We leave that big boy chunky overbet on the river. Again, getting to the river, our opponent's range still thick value. And then what are we going to do? We just shove in that nearly $1,100 into an $800 pot, and we get our opponent to fold the jack nine, the pocket deuces, the pocket nines, all of that stuff because the flush did come in. And if you're thinking here,
Well, Mark, my opponents aren't gonna fold.
again, I don't care, right? If your opponents aren't going to fold, we know what to do with our bluff here on this turn. We just check back on the turn and we realize for free. But I would challenge you, if your opponents here are never folding jack nine or pocket deuces, that means when you have a 6 high flush here, you need to be putting in $1,500. And if you're not putting in $1,500 with the 6 high flush here, that means, well, you probably don't genuinely believe that your opponents are going to call you with jack nine. So what does that mean we should do with our bluffs? Same spot, our opponent check raises, but now the turn pairs the board and our opponent checks. What is their range now? Is it just going to be thick value? No. Actually, this time, I would argue that their range is very, very different here on this turn, because what does our opponent mostly check raise on the flop? 2 pair and sets. And now a lot of these hands have made an invulnerable super nuts hand, quads or a boat, right? They now have quite a lot of nutted hands. Why might they check when the board pairs? Well, because now they have nothing to be scared of. They don't have to worry about a draw coming in. And typically, when the pool slow plays is when their hand is invulnerable, when it's the super nuts. When they fast play is when they're worried about their hand shriveling up in value, some type of draw coming in that's going to prevent them from getting paid. And so at this point, they don't have to worry about that. And so I would say their range here is going to be primarily can play for stacks, hands like pocket nines, pocket deuces, maybe a little bit of thick value, jack nine, ace jack, although I would imagine those hands would keep betting at some frequency here on the turn. And then some draws that got a wild hair up their ass on the flop that have now slowed down since the turn has paired. So you still do have some combo draws here, maybe some ace high flush draws, that type of stuff, which would slow down when the board paired. So what should we do on this turn when our opponent checks? They've got some draws, they've got some thick value, they've got some can play for stacks. What do we want to do with our hand? Well, our opponent is uncapped here, so I may like to go small. And this does a couple of things. Number one, this ensures our opponent sticks around with their draws, and generally, opponents get more elastic, which means much more price sensitive with their draws when the board pairs, because now they know, well, even if I make my draw, I don't make the nuts, I could still be coolered. And so they become much more price sensitive even with hands like ace three of spades here, because the board is now paired. So by going small, we keep the draws in, we give them a chance to start getting greedy with their can play for stacks hands like pocket nines or pocket deuces, right? We give them a chance to start putting in more money, and we just make sure those draws stick around. And now getting to this river, what is our opponent's range? Well, they still have some can play for stacks. They can play for stacks is not going to always check raise the turn when it is an invulnerable super nutted hand. Of course, going small does have another benefit. Even when our opponent doesn't check raise the turn, they may just come out and donk the river some of the time because they don't want this river to go check when we go small on the turn. The smaller the turn sizing you use, the greater the chance that our opponent will just come out and get impatient and donk the river themselves. So we use a big boy turn over bet size. They're just like,
oh, this guy's gonna always bet the river. I'm just gonna check and let them bluff, whatever.
But we didn't do that, so it increased the chance they donk. But they still do have some can play for stacks, some thick value, and then they've got some busted draws that have now been downgraded to air. So what do we do on this river? What happens if we check back? Well, we just lose all the time. What happens if we go big? Well, they just slam the money in our faces with their can play for stacks and snap us off with their thick value, their ace jack and jack nine. What happens if we go very small in this river? Well, we fold out all of the ace high flush draws, the combo draws like queen 10 of spades, king 10 of spades, that type of stuff. All of that stuff folds. And so we fold out the air for a very cheap price and we lose the minimum against the nutted portion of the range. So on this particular board, I may go very small on this river with my 10 high versus the previous example where I wanted to go very big. Again, just asking what is our opponent's range and what happens if. You guys are going to get so sick of this.
Mark, you always talk about heads-up pots, and in my games, in the games I play, the pots always go 3, 4, 5.
Watch this, big boy. Pro opens, and fish 1 and fish 2 are going to call. We're going to defend in the big blind. Flop comes ace 7, 5, and a pro is going to c-bet now into 1, 2, 3 other players. What is this guy's range when he c-bets on this flop? Remember, this is a pro. This is not some just random donkey. What is his range? And I would say here, his range is primarily going to be can play for stacks, thick value, and draws. We can eliminate thin value. We can eliminate showdown value. We can eliminate air from his range when he c-bets into this many people in a aware player. So already, thick value can play for stacks and maybe some big draws. And now a fish calls next to act. This guy may be the most clueless fish in the world, but still, what is his range? What can we eliminate? Probably air, probably showdown value. What else can we eliminate? Can we eliminate can play for stacks? Might he fast play on this board? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is the one spot, guys. When a player calls next to act, where there are multiple players behind him, including fish 2 and us, the hero in the big blind, where even on a more dynamic board, you may see players trap with super strong, kind of nutted, vulnerable hands here. I see players trap here all the time with hands like pocket 7s, pocket 5s, ace 7, ace 5, etc. Because they get greedy. They want the 2 players behind them to come into the pot. So fish 1's range here is going to be can play for stacks, thick value, thin value, and draws. And so we have 2 very strong ranges here. So what should we do? In the big blind, remember the pro's range is going to be super strong. The fish has some traps in their range, and still, even if they're clueless, they're still going to have a lot of ace X here. So what should we do from the big blind? And if you guessed fold, you win exactly 12 cents. Next time you see me, I'll give you 12 cents. We should just fold in this spot. Okay, let's look at a slightly different one. Now a fish raises, a fish calls, we flat on the button, and another fish calls in the big blind. So we are 4 ways with 3 fish, and now the first fish bets into 3 other people. Is this fish's range stronger or weaker than when a pro bets into 3 people? And I would argue here that it is weaker because the fish just has less clue what's going on, right? So I would say here, yeah, we could probably eliminate showdown value. We can probably eliminate air, but a lot of fish here will just monkey stab with thin value. So going to be a little bit wider range. They're going to have can play for stacks, thick value, thin value, maybe some draws. And now the fish next to act folds and facing one range that is a little bit weaker than before. I would be calling here versus the last example, which to me was a clear-cut fold. Now this fish overcalls, and now fish 1 checks. What can we eliminate from fish 1's range? Probably could play for stacks, probably some thick value. So what is the range? Mostly going to be thin value and some draws. We elect to check this one back here. Fish 3 could certainly have us beat with a stronger ace here. So we're going to check this back. And now fish 3 checks. What is fish 3's range here now getting to this river? Probably we can eliminate thick value. We can eliminate can play for stacks, maybe some air, maybe some thin value. And now fish 1 checks again. What is their range going to be? Maybe some air, maybe some thin value. So what should we do here against 2 ranges that are primarily thin value and air? Well, we should bet for value. We are very likely to have the best hand now that we have winnowed both of their ranges. See what I've done there? 2 fish. We've winnowed. I don't even know what winnowed means. Is winnowed a fish thing? I hope it's a fish thing. Please be a fish thing. Todd, you're gonna have to remove this if it's not a fish thing. So now we should go for value. Now that we've winnowed, their range is down. So I would go for value here, just trying to get called by a hand like 7x or pocket kings or queens or something like that. Let's play a 3-bet pot. So let's make the ranges a little bit tighter. Cutoff opens, we 3-bet Kiglies, and the cutoff is going to call. And we're gonna c-bet, and when the cutoff calls, barrels. We can eliminate some of the can play for stacks, so his range probably going to be thick value, thin value, and draws here. We maybe still have some of the showdown value. May just put us on a hand like ace king and call it a hand like sevens. So we can eliminate the air, we can eliminate the can play for stacks, we can eliminate the top and bottom of his range. We go to a turn is a 4 of clubs, and at this point, I would downgrade our hand to maybe the top of that thin value range since we're in a 3-bet pot here at this point. Could be maybe considered thick value, but I think we can get 2 nice streets here. So I would check this hand back because it's going to give us a lot of clarity on the river. Now our opponent comes out and bets just over half pot here. And again, what is our opponent's range? Well, might they have some can play for stacks hands like flushes here? And you may be thinking, well, Mark, a flush isn't the nuts here. A flush isn't can play for stacks. But look at the SPR, guys. Look at the SPR. And like we talked about at the beginning, it's all relative. This guy, once he bets 150 on the river, only has about 700 behind, right? A flush is never folding here in a million years at this SPR. So a flush I would consider can play for stacks at this point, even though the board is paired. So does our opponent have flushes? Sure, they've got some can play for stacks. Might they have thick value here? A hand like ace queen or something like that. Well, sure, I think our opponent could be betting a slightly worse hand for value. Do they have air here? Well, some, possibly. Maybe a hand like 7-8 suited, maybe a hand like Jack 10 or King 10. So they do have some air here. And do they have thin value? Well, probably not. They're not betting 10s or jacks or something like that for value here. So their range is primarily going to be some could play for stacks, some thick value, which we beat some of the thick value, and then some air. And since we beat all of the air and we beat some of the thick value, sure, we're sometimes going to lose here to a flush, but because we beat a large percentage of our opponent's range, I would just be flicking in the call here, expecting to win a good percentage of the time. Well, let's say our opponent checks on the river instead of coming out and betting. At this point, can probably eliminate quite a bit of the can play for stacks. Maybe we can eliminate some of the air because some of the air may just come out and stab here with no showdown values. Maybe still some of it. So our opponent's range on this river probably going to look a lot like thick value, thin value, and air, which we are ahead of almost all of it. So on this river, what happens if we check back? Well, we just win 90+% of the time. But what happens if we bet? Well, the thick value probably pays us off. Hands like Queen X here. Maybe even the thin value gets a little bit sticky here. Puts us on a hand like Ace King after the turn goes check, check. So if we come out and bet here, can we get called by the thick value and thin value? Sure, I think so. So maybe coming out, choosing a appropriate size to get called by all of that, and we're going to win a nice little pot. Finally, what happens if our opponent comes out and bets large on the river for an overbet in a 3-bet pot? I would just say, in general, from the pool, is this the size that they typically choose when they arrive with air or thick value? Well, probably not thick value. Hand like ace queen or something like that isn't taking this size. Hand like king queen isn't taking this size. So we can eliminate thick value. Air, probably not, at least from what I've seen, unless you're against a very, very special player. In general, I would say this size is just primarily going to be weighted to can play for stacks. Can we beat flushes? No. So what would I do to the size? Probably just be doing quite a lot of folding. Finally, let's talk about one more run out. Let's say the turn runs out clean. What is our opponent's range? Well, after they check call the flop, we can eliminate can play for stacks. We can eliminate air. We still have a very strong thick value hand here, so we're going to keep value betting. And now what is our opponent's range getting to the river? Probably going to be some busted draws, which is now air. We can eliminate the showdown value after they've called 2 barrels from us. So just going to be a lot of thick value, thin value. The air's not calling anything here on this river. So let's just choose the biggest size where king queen or queen jack or queen 10, hell, maybe even pocket jacks isn't going to fold. All the draws have bricked. What hand do they put us on a queen high board in a 3-bet pot? Quite a lot. Ace king. Let's take advantage of that. Let's just put the money in here and we're just going to have the best hand here. I don't know, 80% of the time. Sure, sometimes we're going to run into 6x of clubs or something like that. Who cares? I know there's going to be somebody in the comments saying,
well, Mark, sometimes you're going to call us with 6.
Who cares, right? Look, sometimes you're going to go to the beach and lay your towel out, get no sand on it, and then Dr. Phil is going to come doing a barrel roll down the sand, and he's going to come land specifically on your towel and get sand everywhere. And look, there is a possibility that this happens. Does this prevent you from going to the beach? Let's make the configuration even tighter. We open from the low jack, hijack 3 bets, and in an early position configuration, just gonna call with pocket jacks here. We check our opponent's C bets. What is our opponent's range? Well, they may just be C betting their range here, so we can't really eliminate much, but we already know range is gonna be much tighter, right, than say a button versus big blind single raise pot. Now we go to the turn, we check it over. Our opponent double barrels here on this turn. Now what is our opponent's range? So I say we can eliminate air, we can eliminate showdown value, may be able to eliminate thin value. So our opponent's range at this point is going to be draws, thick value, and can play for stacks. What is their worst thick value hand here? Maybe a hand like pocket 10s, right? But they've certainly got queens, kings, aces. If they got 10s, they probably have 9s, right? So quite a lot of thick value. Some can play for stacks here, and then they've got some big draws as well. We get to the river, and now we check it over once again, and our opponent jams here on this river. What is our opponent's range? Well, once again, now those draws have turned into air, but let's think about how much air our opponent has when they 3-bet us. Low jack versus hijack, early versus early. How much air do they have? Well, maybe like ace king, ace queen, ace jack of spades, maybe a hand like king queen of spades. And do they always barrel those ace king, ace queen of spades hands? Having ace high here, do those hands always get triple barreled? I would say most likely not. So they're just not going to have a whole lot of air getting to this river, just not many flush combos. They're probably just not 3-betting hands like queen 9 of spades, or I was going to say 5, 6 of spades, but I just realized that made us straight here on this river. So probably just not a whole lot of air in our opponent's range. Going to be a lot of thick value, aces, kings, queens. Some can play for stacks like 9s. And since our opponent doesn't have a whole lot of air here in this tight versus tight configuration, right? They just don't have a whole lot of flush draws. I would say that the majority of time, we're just not going to be good on this river, right? This is a pretty clean run up for them to triple barrel with aces, kings, queens, etc. And just a lot of combos. There's 18 combos of that. Maybe 6 combos. Maybe they're only 3-bet 10s like half the time. So maybe only 3 combos of 10s that we beat here. We're not going to give them any 9s here. Let's say they just don't 3-bet 9s. And so we got 18 combos we're behind, 3 combos we beat, and then the air portion of their range. Let's say ace king checks back at some point, but let's say ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, king queen. This stuff always bets, so maybe like 4 or 5 combos, right? So already we're seeing we're ahead of like 6 combos, maybe generously. We're behind like 18 here, so there's a situation I'd probably just be folding pocket jacks because of our opponent's range. Let's put a slight spin on it here. They 3-bet us again, but this time on the flop they check back. So what is our opponent's range? Well, probably not a lot of thick value. Their overpairs just keep betting. Probably not much can play for stacks unless we consider aces or kings. Maybe can play for stacks here. Maybe we would consider that in this configuration, but either way, not a whole lot of thick value or can play for stacks, and not a lot of thin value. Like what type of thin value hands do they have a 3-bet in this configuration, right? So gonna be some showdown value. Hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, that type of stuff. Maybe some draws that check back on the flop, and then maybe some air like king queen of hearts or something like that here. So what happens if we come out and bet? Well, showdown value may call a small bet here if they have like ace king, ace queen, ace jack high, that type of stuff. And the draws will probably call, and the air just folds. What happens if we check? Well, I think in the single raise pot, hands like king queen may start taking a stab at us on the turn, but people just play 3-bet pots so passively. I think even that hand may check back, so I think we're just going to check back at a very high frequency if we check again. So may just come out with a small size here, and now they call. What is their range? Not going to be much can play for stacks and thick value. I'm not sure if we consider aces and kings can play for stacks or thick value. Right on that kind of nebulous border here, aces and kings could go either way in this configuration. Not much thin value in the range when they 3-bet us early versus early. So no can play for stacks, no thick value, no thin value. Draws, I would say draws mostly just come out and bet on the flop. If they do have a hand like ace queen of spades or ace jack of spades or something like that, that hand just comes out and c-bets at a high frequency. Maybe occasionally they check back a hand like ace king or ace queen of spades, right? But just not a whole lot of draws. So their range primarily just going to be showdown value here, and not a whole lot of air in their range. Like what is their air? Like king queen of hearts or something like that? We're in a single raise pot. They have a whole lot of air after checking back the flop. Their range is so tight, they just don't have a ton of air getting here. Their range is primarily going to be showdown value. So what happens if we check? Showdown value just mostly checks back. So if we come out and bet small, what might they do with a hand like ace king or ace queen? At least one time, maybe just come out and call if we make the price enticing enough. So we're going to come out and bet small. Our opponent calls. What is their range? Primarily showdown value. And so again, on this river, what is the range showdown value, and what happens if? Well, if we go big, our opponent just folds. Now, I think 2 interesting options here. Going very small here with kind of an insultingly small bet, trying to price them in with a hand like ace king or ace queen or something like that, or just checking, giving them a chance to turn like ace king with the king of spades into a bluff or something like that is also viable. But I think opponents just lean a little bit too much on the passive side, so I just may go very small here, maybe 100, maybe even smaller, maybe just go like 80 or something here. Try to price them in with ace king. Our opponent raises here, and they raise to a small size. Well, what is our opponent's range? Primarily just showdown value, right? What were they going to do with their draws on the flop? Probably just bet when they have like ace king or ace queen of spades, right? So what does this feel like? Well, we have their range. Their range is primarily going to be showdown value. What hand may do this? Maybe a hand like ace king with the ace of spades or something like that. So this is a situation where I may get pretty sticky, snap them off and say, hey, if you got a flush, show me the flush. But I think I'm probably good here, big boy. All right, next one. And the cutoff is going to open. We're going to 3-bet the second best hand in poker. And now the big blind is going to cold call. And so we're going to see a flop against a cold caller here. And our opponent checks. We're going to c-bet and they call. So what is their range? Well, not going to be air. Not really many draws on this board, especially when they cold call. Not really any thin value, except maybe a hand like pocket eights if they even cold call that. So what is their range going to be? It's going to be thick value. Hands like 10s, jacks, queens, that type of stuff, a lot of that. And then maybe some showdown value, maybe a hand like ace king occasionally. But when we have pocket aces and we block them having ace king, a lot of their range here are going to be hands like tens, jacks, queens. So they just have a whole lot of thick value here. So I'm going to size up against that, set up a nice SPR for the river. Again, what is our opponent's range? Tens, jacks, queens. Do we now occasionally lose to 3 combos of queens? Sure. But do we think a hand like jacks or tens is folding here on this river for basically a 2/3 pot size bet here on this river? I would say most likely not. I'm just going to stick the money in and expect when we get called to be good a large portion of the time. All right, let's play a spot out of position now. Button's going to open. We're going to 3-bet, and now the button's going to put in a 4-bet. And maybe this guy's a little more on the aggressive side. So we got ace king. We're going to see a flop, and we check it over, and our opponent goes relatively small here. And yeah, it's a 4-bet configuration, but this is the widest configuration. Some players, some won't, to be fair, but some players will find some 4-bet bluffs here on the button. So we're going to call with ace king high and see what happens. And the turn goes check, check. So what is our opponent's range? Well, we can eliminate can play for stacks and thick value here. Probably don't have thin value either. Maybe they have some showdown value, maybe a hand like ace 4 or ace deuce or something like that. They got a wild hair up their ass pre-flop and is now checking back on the turn. So maybe some thin value, not a lot of draws here, and they do have some air. So their range primarily going to be thin value and air. We get to the river, and what happens if we come out and bet, our opponent maybe gets a little bit sticky with thin value here, maybe puts us on ace king or ace queen or something like that. And if we do come out and bet, well, we can get all the air to fold, but we beat all of the air. And if we check here, well, our opponent checks back with thin value. We lose to that stuff, of course, but maybe they get a wild hair up their ass and just put in some money with air. So we check, and now our opponent jams on this river. What is our opponent's range? Well, we can eliminate the thin value for sure. A hand like ace 4, ace deuce, not going to do this. Remember, we had already said our opponent doesn't have thick value and can play for stacks when they check back the turn. So what is their range on this river? Going to be a whole hell of a lot of air. Hands like ace 5, ace 6, ace 3, king X suited, that type of stuff. Might they have trip 8s here once in a blue moon? Okay, sure. But I would say a lot of the time here, even with ace king high, we're going to have the best hand after walking through what is their range. The configurations are getting tighter. This time the cutoff is going to open. A pro is going to 3-bet on the button. We're going to put in the cold 4-bet here in the big blind. We see starting off this hand 200 big blinds effective. And the pro is going to call 4-bet pot. And we're going to c-bet small here, about 25% pot, and the pro on the button is going to call. So what is his range? Maybe he could have some can play for stacks, like pocket queens. Could also have some thick value here, like aces or kings occasionally. Some thin value, like jacks or tens. And then some showdown value, like ace king. Maybe occasionally a draw, but like I think we can probably just eliminate that. Like really the only draw in their range you're going to have here is a hand like ace king of diamonds, probably just folding the ace jack or ace 10 of diamonds pre to a cold 4-bet from a pro. And we can eliminate the air as well. So primarily just going to be can play for stacks, thick, thin, and showdown value. We go to a turn, and at this point, we hate to see it because now their showdown value is made top pair. We're going to check, and our opponent actually checks it back. So what is our opponent's range at this point? Well, we can eliminate they can play for stacks. The pocket aces and pocket queens would probably continue putting in money here at a decent frequency on this turn, particularly pocket queens. Very, very incentivized to just put in money here and stack the ace X. And then the pocket aces. I know I don't have a 5-bet range against pros, which I don't want to go into too much nuance in this video, neither here nor there, but I would say, you know, some pros are going to 5-bet aces against other pros, some pros might not. And to be clear, I do have a 5-bet range against all recreational players, against all fish. I just don't have a 5-bet range against players who can breathe through their nose. So might some pros 5-bet aces here? Sure. So when you consider he may just 5-bet aces, when you consider he may just bet with aces here, probably just not can play for stacks. Maybe some thick value. Maybe a hand like ace king would check back here at some frequency. And then not a lot of thin value, but I would say a lot of showdown value. Hands like jacks or kings specifically going to make up a big portion of our opponent's range. So we go to the river, and so now our opponent's range on this river is going to be some thick value, some hands like ace king that may check back on this turn, and then some thin value, some hands like jacks and kings. So what happens if we check? Our opponent is probably going to check back with hands like jacks and kings. If we just lose to that, they're probably going to value bet with a hand like ace king, and not much we can do with this SPR about that, so we just lose to those hands. So checking doesn't seem to be great. What happens if we come out and bet small here? Well, this seems interesting. We could probably get hands like jacks or kings to fold at a reasonable frequency, just choosing a relatively small size, maybe 1/3 pot here. So that seems like a reasonable option. Because we come out and bet large here, well, we just get snapped off by a bunch of the ace king that may check back the turn at a reasonable frequency. So betting small seems reasonable. Same type of situation, but let's say we bink a set on the river, and what size should we go here? Again, if we go small, well, we're gonna get snapped off by ace king, but the jacks and kings fold. But what happens if we go large here? Well, if we jam on this river, is our opponent ever folding a hand like ace king on this particular river, which they have quite a bit of after calling the flop and checking back the turn in a 4-bet pot? I would say no. So maybe just coming out and jamming here on the river with pocket tens may be the move once we consider our opponent's range and what happens if. All right, let's go to the tightest of tight configurations. This time we're playing 5-10 because we are against a good pro. 5K deep, he's gonna open. We get a couple of calls in the field, so we're gonna squeeze with ace king suited. He's gonna put in the 4-bet here, and we are going to call. Once again, I don't have a 5-bet range deep against good pros. Don't misapply this, right? If you're not playing 5-10 or bigger, you should just 5-bet aces and only aces. Like, the players in your game are probably 4-betting way too little, so when they 4-bet, they're not 4-bet bluffing, just only 5-bet with aces. They're not gonna fold kings or ace king or whatever they 4-bet. The only reason I'm staying balanced against pros here and not having a 5-bet range is because it's hard to construct a 5-bet range against pros, right? Because the only hand that really wants to get in for value, 500 big blinds deep, is aces. So then we have to find a few bluffs here, but not many bluffs. And then we have to sometimes flat aces to protect our calling rate. So you see it gets convoluted really quick. I just like to simplify. I'm a big, simple dummy. And so against pros, I just don't have a 5-betting range. Don't misapply this. Against fish, it doesn't matter. But against the pro, not going to have a 5-bet range. I'm going to call. We check. Our opponent now c-bets on this flop, and we are going to call. What is our opponent's range? Well, they're going to have thick value and some showdown value here. Probably not going to play for stacks. They just don't have tens in their range here, but it's going to be a lot of thick value, some overpairs, and then some showdown value like ace king high and stuff like that. Go to a turn, we check, and now our opponent checks back. And just a caveat here, guys. Let's say we're in the same spot and we have queens and our opponent double barrels on this turn. What should we do here with queens? What is our opponent's range if they double barrel on this turn? Well, probably just going to be thick value, because they're going to check back if they have thin value with a hand like queens here. They just don't really have many bluffs in this 4-bet configuration when they 4-bet from under the gun, right? Already opening a tight range. So what is their range here? It's probably just going to be can play for stacks, hands like pocket kings and thick value, hands like pocket aces, and hands like ace king. So what should we do here with queens on this turn? If they double barrel, well, we should just fold. But when our opponent does check back on this turn and we have ace king, what is their range? Well, still could be some thick value, maybe occasionally a hand like ace king or pocket aces, and then some thin value, hands like queens or jacks occasionally, although I doubt jacks even get 4-bet at pure frequency here. So going to be a lot of queens, maybe some ace king or aces. Probably the kings just keep putting in money here, trying to cooler a hand like aces or ace king. Probably doesn't really have can play for stacks. Probably a lot of thick value and thin value here, and pretty much nothing else. We go to the river. What happens if on this river? Well, if we check here, our opponent is going to bet with hands like ace king and pocket aces, but they're probably just going to check back with hands like queens. And if we do think they have jacks, probably just going to check back that as well. So a couple options here. Maybe we want to go small on this river to price in our opponent when they have queens, or maybe a couple combos of jacks here. And then if we chop with ace king or get value on by pocket aces occasionally, that's okay. Other option here, which I think is worth considering, is if we don't think our opponent really has jacks here. If they just have queens, ace king, and aces, remember they don't really have kings because they check back the turn. If they just have queens, ace king, and aces, well, yeah, maybe we miss out on getting value from queens if we check here, but it's pretty interesting because what's our opponent going to do if we check? Well, they're probably going to bet for value with hands like ace king that check back the turn, or pocket aces that check back the turn. And then what can we do on this river? Well, if we think our opponent just doesn't really have tens because they wouldn't 4-bet that hand, it doesn't really have kings because they keep putting in money when they're this deep, just trying to cooler us when we have a hand like tens or ace king or pocket aces. So primarily the range on this river is really only going to be a chop or pocket aces. And in this situation, we can certainly have pocket tens in full. We could probably have pocket kings as well in full playing this way. So what does this look like if we check raise the river? Look, we got so excited to check raise this river. We actually put in more money than our stack. I don't know if this is legal. We put in 4620. We only had 4420. This program is so good. Hold'em Manager is so good. Look how good it is. We just check raise for more than the amount of money we had. But either way, I think this gets our opponent to fold a bunch bunch of chops and a bunch of pocket aces here, which is really, really nice. All right, guys, that's it. 2 things. What is their range and what happens if you want our help implementing this into your game? That's what our 5-day small coaching program is for. It is called Basecamp. We work with you for 2 to 3 hours a day for 5 days straight. It is interactive. It is highly tactical, but it is virtual. So you show up in your living room in your pajamas or underwear if you want. If that at all sounds interesting, you want our help implementing this into your game. You're able to ask us questions. You get put on the spot. You get to interact with us. Check out our 5-day Basecamp. Either way, hope this video turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle day.